If it's Tuesday, lawmakers in Congress make their first and potentially only legislative move to prevent another January 6th. Just one day before the committee investigating the attack on the Capitol is set to unveil its final report. Plus, a years-long battle over the public release of Trump's tax returns could end within hours as a congressional committee meets behind closed doors right now on the path forward. In uncertainty at the border, the Supreme Court temporarily delays the end of Title 42, the Trump-era immigration policy that was set to expire tomorrow. As border officials prepare for a surge of migrants, we'll hear from the lawyer leading the charge to end the policy. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamiche Alcindor in for Kristen Welker on a day when Congress is trying to get a lot done fast. There's a government shutdown looming. There's a storm set to hit much of the country just as members are trying to get out of town and home for the holidays. And in just a couple of weeks, control of the House changes hands, which for Democrats means losing control of committees, including those that have sought to hold former President Trump accountable. And right now, members of the House Ways and Means Committee are meeting behind closed doors. We believe they will be voting on whether to make President Trump's tax returns public. The committee received the former President Trump's returns after a years-long legal battle. Later today, committee chairman Richard Neal is expected to speak to reporters. Meanwhile, it's been one day since the January 6th committee issued criminal referrals for former President Donald Trump, placing the blame for the attack on the Capitol squarely on the former president. Now, Congress is making its first legislative move to prevent a future January 6th-style attempt to overturn election results. Early this morning, congressional leaders unveiled the details of the spending bill to avoid a shutdown. Here's Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell expressing satisfaction with the deal.
I'm pretty proud of the fact that with a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, we were able to achieve, through this omnibus spending bill, essentially all of our priorities.
The text of the $1.7 trillion government funding bill includes an overhaul of the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which aims to eliminate the legal ambiguities Trump supporters attempted to exploit in January 2021. The bill would clarify the vice president's role in certifying an election as purely there to count votes. It raises the threshold to force a vote to object to a state's electoral votes, and it would also prevent states from submitting competing slates of electors. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer today called the Electoral Count Act reform one of the most important parts of the spending bill.
One of the most important pieces of this bill is the Electoral Count Act, which will not just reaffirm Democrats' commitment to passing democracy reforms, but it's an important step to preserve our democracy in generations to come. The Electoral College process was flawed, and this makes some very significant corrections.
If approved, the omnibus bill, including the Electoral Count Act reform, would be a tangible bipartisan step to prevent another plot to overturn an election from happening again. NBC's Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill with the latest on the government spending bill. Also with us, Matthew Seligman, fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School. And New York Times Washington correspondent Charlie Savage. He is also an NBC News contributor. So, Ali, I'm going to start with you. This is a spending bill that needs to pass by Friday in order to avoid a government shutdown. There was a lot of Republican opposition to this bill. So tell me, how did this all come together? How did this deal happen?
Republican opposition to this bill, Yamiche, but they ended up with a lot more than they otherwise may have gotten, especially when you consider the fact that usually you see parity when it comes to spending on defense and then on domestic priorities. What happened here is that there's more defense spending in this bill than on domestic priorities. Republicans, in part, saying that's one of the big reasons that they're calling this a win. Another piece of it, though, that we're looking at is the billions in funding for Ukraine. Important that they do that now, especially because we've seen from Kevin McCarthy and others on the House Republican side that they are not eager to continue sending money over there. This has long been in the churn as soon as we knew that Republicans were going to take control of the House come January. So it's clear now more funding heading to Ukraine in advance of that change of control of the chamber. And then, of course, you're also seeing just the timing of this. The deal coming together in the 11th hour. They needed to pass a week-long stopgap just to give themselves the time to get to this point. Ultimately, they're here, and now it's just a question of can they do it by Friday? This is complicated more by the fact that once the Senate is able to take this up, and they are trying to do this as quickly as possible, but once they try to take this up, the thing that might help the Senate do it faster is the storm that's coming into town. The thing that might make it harder for the House, though, is because they have to go second. They're also contending with this storm that's coming through. So some weather mixing with the congressional magic that typically gets things done before the deadline. We're going to see which one ends up winning out. But really, we do expect this to be done as quickly as possible in advance of Friday's deadline.
And then, of course, there's the Electoral Count Act reform. I mean, it's a big deal. Talk a bit about how it ended up in here, given the fact that this could be, as we said, the big legislative result here from January 6th.
Yeah, this was a big legislative priority before the election, and certainly when we left for Thanksgiving, this was the thing that all of the Democratic leaders that we were talking to on the Senate side said they really wanted to get done in this lame duck period. The fact that it ended up in this bill is notable in large part because of its bipartisan backing. We knew that they had the votes on this, but now we'll actually get to see it go forward. Again, one of the tangible outgrowths of the January 6th committee's work, despite the fact that the version of this Electoral Count Act reform is going to be the one that was negotiated by the Senate. There were some key differences here, but just the basics of what this can do is smooth the process, really, and allow that next time around, anyone who should want to exploit the system is not going to be able to do so, especially when it comes down to just the basic idea, for example, that vice presidents do not get to go into the chamber and unilaterally overturn the results of the election just because a president tells them to do so. That was the deduction of Mike Pence, ultimately, but now we know in great detail, thanks to the January 6th committee and others, just how much of a pressure campaign he was under. This bill, in part, fixes that and allows us to go forward with some tangible steps to strengthen the election system in this country after January 6th.
And thank you so much, Ali. And Matthew, I want to come to you. Talk a bit about how important it is that this electoral reforms, that they were included in this spending bill, and sort of the level of change, the significance of that.
It's historically important. It's an achievement that is difficult to imagine in this day and age of extreme partisanship in Congress. That's something that will reform our presidential election process so fundamentally and so positively could get through at a time like this. Now, the principal achievement is that it dramatically reduces the catastrophic risks of political manipulation of the electoral count. We saw some efforts towards that in 2020 and then, of course, on January 6th of 2021, but those efforts really just scratched the surface. And so the bill goes a long way to reduce the ability of members of Congress, of the vice president, and politicians in states from engaging in that kind of political manipulation.
And there's a question here of whether or not this might be the only legislative sort of response that Congress has. What else do you think should be happening? What else do you think Congress should do in order to shore up our election systems?
Well, this is one of the most important things that Congress could have done, and it was one of the most pressing threats, but many threats still remain. So the process of electing a president starts at the states, and there's still a risk of manipulation of the results by partisan actors in states. And so we see this in the gubernatorial election in Arizona, where the candidate who lost, Carrie Lake, is still attempting to overturn that election. There are county officials who toyed around with the idea of refusing to certify the results. So while this shores up pretty fundamentally the process once it gets to governors and then Congress, it's still a process that begins, in your local precinct. And so there's so much that needs to be done to shore up the process from the very moment that people vote all the way until the end.
And Matthew, I mean, part of what made January 6th, critics would say, of Trump would say, is that they pushed and really didn't think about the laws. But I wonder, when you look at the Electoral Reform Act here, do you think it could have prevented what happened on January 6th? Do you think any legislation can prevent something like January 6th from happening if you have bad actors who are trying to overturn an election?
Yes, I do think it can make a real positive effect here. And the reason is that what we saw was not a violent coup. I mean, you see on your screen right now how violent it got, but ultimately that was a sideshow. The real attempt to steal the presidency was written on paper. It was an attempt to manipulate the law. And that's because we still live in a democracy where people are committed to following what at least they think the law is. And so by clarifying the law and fortifying it against manipulation, we still live in a country where people are going to follow the clear law. At least most people are, at least politicians of good faith, and importantly, courts. And because we have that clarified and fortified backstop, I do think that except for the most extreme actors, this would have prevented a lot of what happened in 2020 and 2021. Now, someone who's willing to engage in violence and break the law, well, there's no law that can fundamentally prevent that. But this will go a long way towards preventing the manipulation of the law to achieve a stolen presidency.
And when you try to put this into context, I wonder, are the committee's recommendations without sort of real legislative action? Do you think that it's possibly risk being being symbolic if you don't have actual action behind it?
Well, I think that this is tangible, concrete action. And so I think there are really two possible actions that came out of the committee's work. The first is electoral count reform, and we've now seen that getting to the finish line. That, I think, is ultimately the most important, because this is a historic achievement that will last hopefully for 100 years or more. You know, the last version of this legislation was passed in 1887. So this is a great law. It prevents a lot of the risks that we saw, and it will last for generations. That's incredibly important. Now, the other possible result of the committee's work is the criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. Now, that's also extremely important for accountability, but it's fundamentally retrospective. Now, there is a prospective dimension to it about the possible disqualification of Donald Trump from holding office again, but nonetheless, the most important thing going forward to strengthen our democracy is strengthening the law for counting electoral votes, and that's what Congress has achieved.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. And Charlie, I want to, of course, come to you. The other thing happening right now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is that there is this closed door behind the scenes meeting of the House Ways and Means Committee about Trump's tax returns. So how significant of a vote would that be if they choose to publicize them after this years-long legal battle?
That's right. Well, that would be a significant act of transparency at the tail end of Democratic control of Congress. That Congress obviously is ending, that control is ending next month after 4 years. And from the beginning of this period, right after the 2018 midterm, when Democrats took over the House, they had been trying to drag Trump's taxes into the light. Trump, of course, broke with modern precedent by refusing to make public his tax returns, first as a major party presidential candidate and then as a sitting president. And so this is sort of making that not stand in the end. As it were. Of course, Biden has gone back to that norm and did release his taxes. Whether there's going to be major new revelations in these documents, assuming they do let them make them public, which I think is a matter of political reality, is probably where we're headed here. That's still open to question. One of the reasons for that is there have been cracks in the secrecy surrounding Trump's taxes before this. The state prosecutors in New York got a hold of a lot of his financial information, and that's what led to the prosecution of the Trump Organization, which was convicted earlier this month of fraud and led to the civil lawsuit by the state attorney general against Donald Trump and his family members, also accusing them of defrauding banks. And also my organization and your former one, the New York Times, not me personally, got a hold of a lot of Trump's tax information in 2020 and published a lot of information about then, showing how many years he had paid virtually no taxes, and then he was under audit for a just gigantic tax refund of about $70 million that he had requested at one point. Still, the Times did not get tax returns from 2019, 2020, which is included in this tranche that the Congress did get. And so there may be something new in there as well about what's going on with auditing of him, which was the ostensible purpose of the committee in asking for the returns in the first place.
And an important point to make, that we've had a sort of window into these tax returns. That being said, the Supreme Court, it declined to block the committee's access to them in the first place. How significant is that move, and sort of could it possibly inform today's vote when you think about what lawmakers are voting on?
It's certainly significant from a sort of legal politics point of view. Trump was assisted mightily by the fact that the lawsuit the committee filed in 2019 to try to enforce its legal authority to obtain his tax returns was assigned to a Trump-appointed district court judge, Trevor McFadden, who sat on the case for 2.5 years, simply refused to rule. And there's like a weird loophole in our legal system that nothing forces a judge to rule one way or the other by any particular deadline, and that can be used to just elongate the process. In that case, Judge McFadden helped Trump get past the 2020 election without Congress getting a hold of his returns. And only after the Biden administration came in and then gained control of the Treasury Department and said, yes, Congress has a right to get these returns if it asks for it under the law, did he start paying attention to that lawsuit and ultimately concede, yes, the law is on Congress's side. That appeals court agreed, the full appeals court agreed. And if the Supreme Court had stepped in and said, well, we're going to put a hold on this until you fully litigated your appeal before us, it would have pushed this delay past January. Republicans would have taken over the Ways and Means Committee and dropped the request. And so the fact that the Supreme Court last month decided not to step in without any dissents is a remarkable failure from Trump's point of view of the court that he pushed so far to the right to come in and aid him personally.
Well, Charlie Savage of the New York Times, thank you so much. And coming up, we'll have much more on these big developments on the Hill, plus a wild story about an incoming congressman's past and accusations he faked his resume. The panel's next. Plus, Title 42 in flux, live reporting from the border amid new developments in the legal fight over a pandemic-era immigration policy. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Among the items in the $1.7 trillion spending bill Congress hopes to pass this week is additional money to help prosecute January 6 rioters. The package includes more than $2.6 billion for U.S. attorneys, an increase of more than $212 million. The House Appropriations Committee says that additional funding is meant to help prosecute January 6 cases as well as domestic terrorism cases. All this comes a day after the January 6 committee voted to make criminal referrals of former President Trump to the DOJ, and a day before the committee is set to release its final report. For more, I'm joined by Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Faiz Shakir, senior advisor to Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and Brad Todd, Republican strategist and founder of On Message. So I really, of course, want to start with you, Tia. Talk a little bit about this additional funding that Congress has passed here. What is it meant to do? How significant do lawmakers think it is?
Well, the thing to remember is that new indictments are coming down every day. Even today, more people are being identified. And then, of course, all these hundreds of cases are still winding their way through the criminal justice system. So it is a big expense. It's a big caseload. And then also when you talk about domestic terrorism, of course, we've seen some mass shootings and a lot of going on that has its roots in terroristic activity, domestic terroristic activity, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism. So it's clear that there's a big load on the Department of Justice, and Congress wants to help them do their job to address it.
And Faiz, is this a big victory for Democrats to be able to get this funding in there, even though there was a lot of back and forth?
Well, it's a part of a truth and reconciliation process, Shamish. Like, if we're going to be honest about a dark period in American history, we got to have accountability over it, and we can't just look away from it or say, hey, it didn't happen. We have to hold people to an account that says, hey, if you did something wrong, act in a traitorous way, we're going to come after you, so that future generations don't get the idea that somehow you can subvert democracy and no one will really care.
And Brad, we heard Mitch McConnell talk about the fact that it's very clear that former President Trump, that he was to blame for January 6th. We're now seeing all of these sort of things, legislative, I should say, measures being passed. Is that sort of the real response here? Is that the real response from Republicans? It's the one that's in writing, would you say?
Well, I think, first off, the referral to the DOJ from a congressional committee has all the enforcement power of an interoffice memo, right? There's nothing that goes with it. It's still upon the DOJ to evaluate the facts and decide what legal action they might take. I think the additional money that's for prosecuting here is fairly non-controversial, although it will become controversial if it becomes part of the DOJ's baseline. There's real concern among Republicans that DOJ doesn't get mission creep here and decide that it's going to be even more active on in matters of politics. And so I think watching for the next year's budget cycle is going to be where Republicans are going to weigh in.
But there's also the Electoral Reform Act. They're changing and making sure that there are no ambiguities here, the ones that former President Trump and others try to exploit. What do you make of that and the Republicans signing on to that?
It's pretty bipartisan. I mean, Rand Paul's come out for it. The Cato Institute's come out for it. Plenty of conservative groups are for it. And I don't think clarity is anything anybody objects to. Although, for some people who claim there was no need for clarity back in 2021, I think now that say we need clarity is a little bit of a mixed message. But I don't think it's very controversial.
I do think, to your point, though, there is a lot in this omnibus spending package that is almost like a rebuke of some of the kind of MAGA Republican talking points. You've got the Electoral Count Act. You've got the funding to prosecute January 6th, those accused of carrying out January 6th. But you also have things like funding for Ukraine and, a lot of things that even especially in the Senate, they say we've got to go ahead and get this done because we're not sure what's going to happen when Republicans take control in the House. And there's a lot there that Senate Republicans are spinning it. It is bipartisan, but it's a lot of things that Democrats have been saying needs to happen.
I think you're saying this, but politically it's Trump bait because it's asking and begging him to say, go ahead. You want to campaign against a Justice Department investigation? You want to campaign against Electoral Vote Count Act? Speak out. And it's interesting, actually, by the way, he hasn't tweeted, he hasn't said anything. He's kind of gone into a cocoon and hasn't spoken in a long time, which is odd for somebody who's very gabby, as we know. And so I think he's operating and running scared. And I think Democrats are saying we need to bring him into the public debate if he wants to be there.
There's no question Democrats want Donald Trump in the debate because they think it advantages them. They want to attack Donald Trump and say, oh, we just need to be rid of him, except please let's not be rid of him. I think this omnibus, though, even though there are plenty of parts, there's something in here for everyone in some ways. But I think that it's a real point for the Senate here to take a chance and try to do this longer-term omnibus over the objections of Kevin McCarthy and House Republican leaders, in fact, most conservatives. The Senate Republicans, or just enough of them anyway, are going along with something that House Republicans don't want them to do.
Senate Republicans, including Mitch McConnell.
Well, at least a third of them will. And really you can look at the Senate Republican Conference as three groups, right? 16 people voted to delay leadership elections. Those are sort of critics of Senator McConnell. There are another 16 or so who are pretty staunch defenders of Senator McConnell no matter what he does. The other 16 people are kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
And so I think that Senator McConnell's taken a pretty big chance here by agreeing to something that House conservatives don't want. We'll see if that impacts his leadership potential.
To your point of Trump going away, it's a fundamentally Republican question, right? That's the point. Is like he's never gone until Republicans decide he's gone, which is playing out in the course of this debate because of the fracturization, which Democrats will take all day. If you want the House Republicans,
not just take, but seek,
seek all day.
Well, I want to also turn to another story. Republican George Santos. Faiz, I'm coming to you first.
From fake elector to fake elector.
Because there's some folks are wondering, how did Democrats not see this in the opposition research? I mean, the reporting here is that he has questionable records for school, for work, for real estate property. There's a check fraud case in Brazil, and somehow he's wealthy and having all this money after being evicted, according to the New York Times reporting. So how did Democrats miss this?
Well, they blew it on multiple levels, of course, but it wasn't just a Democratic miss. Obviously, Republicans...
I do want to stay on Twitter.
Yeah, no, certainly missed deep dive research. right, didn't do the deep dive. You didn't have a proper vetting of them, for damn sure. But I think, actually, there's going to be more explosive content yet to come, Yamiche, because what we don't know is how this guy got wealthy overnight. How do you get wealthy overnight? You didn't win a lotto ticket. What happened here? And what we're going to find, I think, is some illegal wrongdoing, which actually would then jeopardize his actual seat. Right now, if you lie on your resume, you embellish your resume, okay, fine. People do that. It's not good. It's not appropriate. But you start committing financial crimes to get into office, now we're talking again about DOJ prosecution.
Brad, how did Republicans not see this? How did he become their nominee?
Well, primary voters pick the nominee, and I suspect that they'll have a different choice in 2 years. I mean, I suspect he'll have a tough primary. I suspect he'll struggle in his primary. I suspect if he were to get through that, he's going to have a really tough general election. But, he'd been active in New York politics for quite some time. He'd run before. This is the way primary voters get to pick.
But
people
I
in Washington don't get to pick.
I mean, I worked on Long Island. There's a strong Republican Party there. So the question is still, the Republican Party, did they not, the people that were running against him, the actual party officials, did they not go and say, let's check this guy's resume out?
It's a thing of the past to think that party officials have any say-so on who Republican Party nominates. I mean, to say Republicans herd like cats is an insult to cats. And, you know, it's just not possible anymore for even if Republican primary party officials had decided he shouldn't be the nominee, that they could control it.
But I think it also tells us a lot about American politics, for better or for worse. You know, it's not about who's the best qualified. It's not about who can prove their resume. It's about who is able to win the primary, who is able to win over voters. And a lot of people are able to navigate that system in ways that perhaps shield their other shortcomings. We've seen that. I mean, Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the list goes on and on and on of people say, well, how did that person get elected? They worked the system, they got the votes, and they won. And that's, you know, for better or for worse, that's America's democracy.
And briefly, I mean, this also shows that gumshoe reporting, just going out there and checking this, that gets you some answers here, Tia, for our industry, that is.
That does. And I mean, I think also, you know, in defense of the local media, there have been limitations, downsizing, things like that. But I think there were grumblings on the ground about Representative Santos or candidate Santos, and it didn't really matter to the people who were who had to elect him. I mean, I'm not saying they knew everything, but there were, you know, there were some things out there.
This is a black eye for the New York Times, though. It's the largest newsroom in America, and it's right there in their backyard. And they didn't find this out in a full year of campaigning. I mean, it's a rough day for the Times.
It's a black eye for, I would say, anybody involved in this. Totally. What did you say? I mean, Republicans, Democrats, maybe journalists, but
and the least black eye for the New York Times.
I know,
who ultimately reported.
You started out by giving the New York Times credit. I want to back up just a second.
When he announced for the race, we were told the House Republican aides knew that this guy was toxic and didn't want to touch him with a 10-foot pole. What does it say about Republicans who knew that and didn't say anything? That is morally reprehensible.
Big questions of how this man ended up here, but we'll definitely keep watching this story. Tia, Faiz, Brad, thank you, all of you, for doing this. Up next, what the Supreme Court's move to block Title 42 from expiring tomorrow means for migrants, border communities, and the Biden administration. But first, we're excited to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with clips and highlights from the best archive in news. Here's then Senator and presidential candidate Al Gore responding to accusations that he was faking being a Southern conservative in 1988.
Let's look at this point, and you know, that was Tennessee, and you are something of a favorite son there. Now you're trying to pass that message off across the South. And if you look at your voting record, your opponents say you look more like Ted Kennedy than Sam Nunn. The Americans for Democratic Action last year gave you a rating of 60. The American Conservative Union gave you a rating of 6. Aren't you a liberal?
No, I'm not, and those labels don't mean what they once did. You know, the Republican Party chairs all across the South are the ones that are pushing that line. They had a big strategy meeting a few weeks ago and decided that their top priority in 1988 had to be to stop Al Gore. What they're really saying is that they have decided who would be the strongest Democratic nominee and who is the person they would least like to face in the fall.
Welcome back. Chief Justice John Roberts waded into the messy waters of border policy yesterday, granting a request from 19 attorneys general in Republican-led states to delay the removal of a border policy known as Title 42. Now, Title 42 is the pandemic-era policy that stops nearly all migrants from seeking asylum at the border under public health concerns. That policy was set to expire tomorrow after an appeals court denied Republicans' last request from a late stay last week. Roberts ordered that appeals court ruling to be put on hold until the Supreme Court acts, asking the Biden administration and immigrants' rights groups to file responses by this afternoon. The Department of Homeland Security responded to the state yesterday, saying it would use the delay to continue preparing to manage the border in a, quote, safe, orderly, and humane way when the order does end. NBC's Guad Venegas is near the border in El Paso, Texas, as migrants wait to see if they will be allowed to seek asylum. I'm also joined by the lawyer who filed a brief to the Supreme Court today, ACLU's Lee Gallant. He is the deputy director of the ACLU's Immigrant Rights Project. Thank you, both of you, for being here. So, Guad, let's start with you. Talk to me about the latest of what's happening on the border right now. What are you hearing?
Yamiche, we arrived here yesterday, and we still saw groups that were crossing. They were allowed to seek asylum, but today everything has changed. I came up here so we can get a wide view. The National Guard has arrived today, as well as Texas State Troopers. They set up barbed wire, and you can see groups of migrants. There's about 200 to 300 now that have been stopped by the National Guard. We're going to walk over to this direction so we can get a better view. They've been stopped by the National Guard by this barbed wire, and they're being told that if they want to enter the United States, they need to do it legally through a port of entry. Every 15 minutes, a National Guard member will come up and speak to them, and that's the only communication. You can see the migrants. These are men, women, and children that have been waiting now that they are no longer allowing asylum seekers to enter the U.S. As of yesterday, members of Border Patrol were allowing some of the migrants to cross the river, come in, and then turn themselves in. But you can see over on the other side, there's a line of vehicles from the National Guard and from Texas State Troopers that goes as far as we can see. Over in that direction, there's a gate to the fence, and this is the gate that a lot of the asylum seekers were approaching to turn themselves in. So as of this morning, that is no longer being allowed by officials. These are members of the National Guard again and Texas State Troopers that are now set up along with a new barbed wire fence. This, Yamiche, just for reference, is just south of downtown El Paso, where a lot of the migrants from Juarez had been lining up for days over the last week. This is the area where more than 1,000 came, and that initiated that large surge of migrants that we saw lining up, being processed. Eventually, it created a chaos in El Paso where local authorities said they did not have enough resources. We've also spoken to some of the migrants that are over on this side just under me who tell me they already tried crossing and they were returned here to the Mexican side, Yamiche.
Well, important reporting from on the ground. Thank you so much, Guad. And Lee, I want to turn to you. You, of course, are filing today a brief to the Supreme Court. So what is the argument that you're making to say that Title 42 should end?
Yes, thanks for having me. We'll be filing literally any second, and we are going to make two central points. The first is that Title 42 was never supposed to be permanent. It was a temporary measure to respond to the pandemic. No one, including the states that are trying to intervene in this case, claims there's a COVID emergency anymore. So it's a complete pretext to be misusing the public health laws. What we're also going to be saying is that Title 42 is doing horrific damage. It may seem like a technical policy, it may seem very abstract, but thousands and thousands of people, including families with little children, have been sent directly back into danger, including right into the hands of cartels. The major flaw with Title 42 is not that it stops everyone from getting asylum. We have never said that everyone who's coming is entitled to asylum. What Title 42 does, though, is prevent anybody from getting an asylum hearing. No asylum hearing whatsoever is permitted under Title 42. That's the flaw. We have to return to our regular immigration laws that were in existence before the pandemic. Those provisions allow the federal government to deport people very quickly, contrary to what the states may be saying. But the critical difference is that although they allow quick deportations, they first provide people with an asylum hearing so that those who have credible asylum claims can come in. Others will be deported routinely. But what you hear from the states is the attempt to misconstrue what's going on as if there's no Title 42, there's open borders. That's not true. There are plenty of ways to remove aliens immigrants who don't get, who can't show asylum, but at least they will get a chance to show that. Title 42 is summary expulsion without any asylum hearing, and it's basically sending people directly into the hands of cartels.
I also want to ask you, Lee, when the Supreme Court calls for responses, typically that means that the full court will now be involved in deciding the matter. So tell me a little bit about when you think that this issue might get resolved. What's the timeline you're expecting here?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a difficult question. So right now, Title 42 would be in place regardless of what the Supreme Court did, because as you mentioned in your opening, it wasn't supposed to end until midnight tonight, 12:01 a.m. East Coast time. So at 12:01, if the Supreme Court has not acted, Title 42 will remain in place, unfortunately. We don't know when the Supreme Court will act. I think you're right that Chief Justice Roberts, who issued the temporary administrative stay, will refer it to the full court. It's possible they act before midnight and lift the stay. That's what we're hoping for. So Title 42 ends as it was intended to end from the district court's ruling. But it also could be a number of days before the Supreme Court acts. Ultimately, we hope that they will deny the stay. We are prepared to go through the appeals, but we don't think, given the blatant illegality of Title 42, that it should remain in place while appeals go forward.
And Lee, there are some lawmakers like Governor Greg Abbott who are saying that this is going to result, if Title 42 is lifted, that it's going to result in chaos, a humanitarian crisis of a different kind. What's your response to that, given, and how confident are you that there's a real plan if Title 42 is lifted to not have that sort of humanitarian crisis?
So I think the federal government has a plan, but unfortunately, because the states are trying to intervene, it's created uncertainty about whether Title 42 will be there or not. I think the one thing I would emphasize is if you close the border, of course, people are going to be backed up. So perhaps there is going to be short-term influxes, but I don't think that's going to last. I think what we're going to do is get through that quick backlog at the border, put processes in place, and people will get hearings, hopefully. I think the federal government has more than enough resources if it wants to provide processes at the border. They just need to prioritize that. And I think no one should judge by what's going on for the next couple of days to then extrapolate from there about how this would work on a more long-term basis. We can make this work. We just now need to move away from the temporary pandemic measure, Title 42, and use regular immigration procedures. If people don't think that we've come through immigration laws, strike the proper balance between migration flows and asylum hearings, that can be debated, but we cannot misuse the public health laws. That is a very dangerous precedent to continue misusing these public health laws.
And briefly, you're saying that the federal government, you think, has the resources, but there are some cities that these migrants end up getting bused to. So I wonder, how confident are you that this is going to not be more dangerous for those migrants potentially if they end up in cities without the resources that they could get or that they need?
Well, I think the NGOs are prepared, the cities, states, I think we all need to do the right thing to get the resources, but I don't think anything could be more dangerous than what Title 42 is doing, literally sending them back into the hands of cartels or sending them to countries like Haiti. I think we'll have to do our best to get the resources. The resources are there, but Title 42 has to end. The harm is really horrific. I mean, I think the border is out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people, but what's going on is really tragic.
Yeah. Well, Lee, thank you so much of the ACLU, right? And of course, the filing there.
Thank you so much for having me.
And after the break, courtroom chaos and FTX fallout. What's next for Sam Bankman-Fried and the investigations into his firm's collapse as the former king of crypto prepares to return to the U.S.? You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried was back in court today in the Bahamas. This comes after some confusion in court yesterday where the former CEO was expected to waive his extradition rights, but instead requested to see the indictment against him before his extradition. Bankman-Fried has been in jail in the Bahamas since his arrest last week. And joining me now is NBC News technology correspondent Jake Ward. So tell us what's going on. What do we know about the latest?
Well, Yamiche, as you mentioned, we expected him to basically go along with extradition, but then he, in his appearance yesterday, not only did he appear visibly shaking and out of sorts, he also demanded to see the federal filing, the court documents filed by the federal government. And as a result, it set off a flurry of speculation that he was going to somehow fight extradition, that would set this back by months. Now he seems to have changed his mind again. That may be, of course, because the conditions he's being held in have been called by the State Department unhygienic, unsanitary. Those are not nice prisons to be in the Bahamas. So that may be why he's turning things around here, Yamiche.
Well, thank you so much, Jake Ward. And Now, of course, we're going to turn to, while Sam Bankman-Fried continues to grapple with the legal fallout of the collapse of his company, FTX, Congress is also dealing with the political fallout from Bankman-Fried's campaign contributions. Joining me now is Democratic Senator from Minnesota, Tina Smith. She is also a member of the Senate Agricultural Committee and the Senate Banking Committee, both of which recently held hearings on the collapse of FTX. So thank you, Senator, for being here. The first question, of course, is, were your colleagues too eager to accept donations from Sam Bankman-Fried, even when Congress was still working on how to regulate this crypto industry? It's a big question that so many people are asking.
Well, you know, I think in many cases, Sam Bankman-Fried made contributions to my colleagues without even, you know, we certainly weren't soliciting these contributions. I think that the thing that we should be focused on right now is, one, getting to the bottom of what actually has happened with this FTX massive collapse. It looks like there are unbelievable levels of fraud and corruption and thievery that have happened here. So getting to the bottom of that is number one priority. And then I think our big job is to figure out where are the regulatory gaps that we need to fill in to make sure that we're providing consumer protection. You know, in this country, people can choose to invest in nearly anything that they want to, but they deserve to know that those investments are happening, or that, you know, betting is happening in a world where there's an even and fair playing field and they have good information.
And Senator, some of your colleagues have called for banning of crypto. What's your position on that issue?
Well, I've heard that, and I think that I just don't understand how that would happen. Crypto has crypto assets, and the speculating on crypto assets has proliferated around the country and around the world. I think their latest estimates I heard were something like 40 million Americans have some sort of an investment or stake in crypto. So to say that we're just going to ban it, I don't quite know how that would work. What I think we should be focused on is making sure that those Americans have some protections, that just as when they invest in stocks or other assets, there's some ability to make sure that the places that they're putting their money, that their money is in some way safe, or at least that they know what the risks are. And I believe that that is not the case when it comes to a lot of crypto investments.
And you're talking about putting in some protections. I wonder, do you believe that crypto should be considered a commodity? And do you really think that there's enough tools there at the CFTC to regulate it in a way that is really impactful?
Well, to tell you the truth, I sort of think that this debate about whether crypto is a commodity or is it a stock, does it function more like a security, hides the basic reality, which is that we know how in this country to protect consumers from shady financial deals and from unethical actors, like it appears that FTX was. And we should be making sure that those laws are being enforced as they should be. And then where there are gaps, we should be filling them in. I personally think that the SEC has the level of experience and the breadth of staff to be a really key player here. I'm not saying that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission doesn't have an important role to play, but I think that's not really the issue. The issue is how to make sure that there are those basic fundamental consumer protections in place so that people don't get ripped off.
And I want to turn to the issue of immigration. Title 42 is set to expire. Is now the best time to be lifting this, given the fact that there are some people who are worried that this could cause a humanitarian crisis?
Well, I think that Title 42 has been used as the excuse of the pandemic. The terribleness of the pandemic was used as an excuse for just stripping away some of our fundamental protections when it comes to immigration, and I don't support that. I would just point out, as we have these challenges at the border, no doubt about it, that the president requested funding to address those challenges. The Democrats, as we have finished up this big bill that we're just about to pass, God willing, in the next day or two to fully fund the government, wanted to get funding in there to help deal with the challenges of the border. And every step of the way, the Republicans said, no, we're not going to provide that money. It's like a recipe for chaos. And that is a problem that we're dealing with right here, right now, as we have thousands of people who are facing a true humanitarian challenge.
And there is going to be this anticipated surge in migrants. Do you have confidence that the administration, the Biden administration, has a plan to deal with that?
Well, I know that they have a plan. I just think it is shameful that the Republicans in Congress refused to fully fund and provide resources to make sure that people had all of the, that states and Border Patrol had the assets and the resources they need to help make sure that our immigration system is functioning the way it should be functioning. We should not be summarily rejecting people who may have a lawful claim for asylum, but we need to have some sort of infrastructure in place, and that's what I think has been, that's what's been missing.
Then what is actually needed, given the fact that Democrats have had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House for 2 years? What needs to happen?
As you well know, Democrats have a 50-person majority in the Senate, 51 when the vice president votes with us. But in order to get any kind of legislation through, you need 60. You need 10 Republicans. And that is the reality of the budget bill that we are about to pass, I hope, as I said, in the next day or so, which will include many, many good things. But unfortunately, it will not include the kind of support we need for a rational immigration policy and immigration implementation on our southern border.
And you, of course, smartly just said that there is 60 votes really needed to do a lot of what needs to be done in Congress. In just a few weeks, Republicans, they're going to take control of the House. How much do you think Congress will be able to accomplish given this new reality of divided government that we'll be living in?
Yeah, well, listen, I'm an optimist. That is how always how I approach these things. What I would say is that there's a lot of proof that our Republican colleagues in the House are going to have to provide. The question, I think, where all of us are wondering, are they capable of doing their job? Can they put together a majority that will actually allow them to do their job and to govern? And the first step is going to be electing a leader, and that seems to be uncertain. In the meantime, we all have to be looking for ways to collaborate across party lines. I do that all the time, and find places where we can make headway and find common ground. I am very glad that we're getting this big budget bill passed this year so that is not sort of the federal budget isn't turned into a political weapon as we move into the first few months of 2023. While I hope that the new Republican majority, a very slim majority in the House, can get its act together so that they can actually do their job.
Well, Minnesota Senator Tina Smith, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Still to come, woman, life, freedom. That's the main slogan protesters in Iran have been taking to the streets for nearly 3 months and saying. The latest reporting on the demonstrations and the regime's future next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Anti-government protests have been going on in Iran for months now. Despite the regime's ongoing violent crackdown, the demonstrations remain one of the most serious challenges to the government since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Now, video airing on Iranian state television shows what appears to be public hangings, which is just disturbing. Activists believe the public executions, which began earlier this month, are an attempt to create fear and crush anti-government protests. It has now been more than 3 months since protests first broke out in Iran after a Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, died days after being arrested by the country's morality police. Joining me now is NBC News Tehran Bureau Chief Ali Arouzi. Ali, thanks for being here. So, of course, now it sounds like the regime has turned to public executions. What impact is that having on demonstrations and protests and people wanting to take to the streets?
Hi, Yamiche. Well, look, it has had the effect that they wanted, the desired effect, to instill fear in society. Obviously, public hangings and these trials are going to frighten people. And it's also the trials that have been very frightening. You know, these people have been arrested, convicted within a day, and then within weeks executed, no due process. No lawyers that they can choose themselves. The lawyers are appointed by the regime. And then the execution itself is terrifying. It's done in public. These people are hoisted up a crane and left dangling there as a would-be warning to other protesters. And yes, that has brought fear into society, but it's also made people a lot more angry, a lot more resolute, and a lot more determined to reach their rights and overcome all of these abuses that have been going on in Iran Iran for 40 years, basically not having any basic human rights. So you mentioned in the lead up that one of the main chances in Iran is woman life freedom. There are a whole host of chants. And after these executions, some of the chants that have become very prevalent are the names of the people that are being executed. So I think the government wanted to use this as a deterrent, but it's backfired and they've only poured fuel on the fire.
And you said that they're backfiring, so it sounds like there's no sign that these protests are slowing or that they're really sort of having people say, I'm not going to go out and protest. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Look, I mean, they ebb and flow. The crackdown has been seriously brutal. They've killed 500 people, arrested almost 20,000 people. 70 minors have been killed, but people are still protesting. At 9 o'clock every night, like clockwork, people open their windows and chant death to the dictator, down with the Islamic Republic. The city is covered in graffiti. Women refuse to wear the hijab. It is not a normal society. It's not a functioning country. It is a dystopia, and there are still pockets of protests every day. They're not as large as they were a month ago, but next month they may be larger. There is no sense that this is going to quieten down anytime soon, because there is such a massive gulf between the regime and the regular people, and there's no middle ground between them.
And in the few seconds we have left here, what's the latest on this Iranian actress that was arrested?
Well, she's been charged for spreading false information and false propaganda. And I have to point out, I mean, she is about as famous as an actress as you're going to get in Iran. She was in an Oscar-winning film. She's got like 8 million followers on Instagram. Her Instagram account has been shut down, but her fate is undetermined right now.
Yeah, Ali Arouzi, thanks so much. And thank you for being with us this hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues ahead.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.